Okay. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first cover seminar of 2024. And as usual, I'm not going to do a very elaborate intro. I just wanted to say that was it last year when you got hired at Essex, Mrinalini?
Yes.
When you get hired, I was like, let's just do something with you. In part because I remember seeing the line in your bio saying something about like finding refuge in the business school, and um, never more has a line in a bio sort of resonated with me as someone who naturally does not necessarily belong here, but has found myself here through a series of historical accidents and misadventures. Um, so with that as an idea, I think we're going to head over to you and we're going to have a chat about literature. Um,
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I don't know. My talk today might sort of complicate that notion of at least I hope that it will complicate that notion of refuge. But certainly that is true that and I think that will become clear in talk that there is a sense in which the fact that I'm here in the business school as a literature scholar by training and by work it is a sort of a strange happening. It's a strange thing that's going on, and so I'm thinking about that. And so the preface to this today, I don't have any slides. I am going to just speak. But the preface I want to make to that is that this is what I'm talking about today is really a project that I've been working on for about 10 years. So I've been thinking about it a very long time. And what I'm going to share with you about the project itself, it may necessarily be a bit schematic. And so in the discussion portion, I'm happy to clarify any of that or to talk about that in more detail. But really, today's talk is a kind of an extended question that I'm asking you rather than an answer that I've put together. And I hope that's suitable for a seminar in that sense. I mean, that's an invitation really to you as I begin talking, that it is a question. It's a question I have, and it's a point I've got to in the project where I don't know what the answer is, but it's something I've been thinking about and has become, as I'll discuss later, increasingly important to me. So I'm going to talk for probably about 25 minutes, and then hopefully we can have some discussion about that. So where I want to begin is with a study by Leela Gandhi, who's a postcolonial theorist and scholar. In her study of late 19th century figures who came together across the colonial and metropolitan divide, she pays particular attention to people I think we could describe in the really old-fashioned English sense as cranks. Those of you who may remember, who are old enough to remember the chain of vegetarian restaurants that used to exist in the UK called Cranks, which was the first vegetarian chain in the country, played on that notion of the crank, the eccentric. Or that is to say, people who held beliefs that were in various ways on the fringes of mainstream knowledge and practices of the day. So in the context of the late 19th century, what we're talking about are things like vegetarianism, homosexuality, theosophy. I don't know how many of you are aware of theosophy, but theosophy is a particular kind of combination of philosophy and metaphysics that was very popular at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. So her book, Leela Gandhi's study of affective communities, focuses on how the shared project of understanding our kinship with animals, vegetarians, anti-vivisectionists, anti-colonialists, sort of quite strange cohort, developed a common language for understanding how animals and humans are commensurate commensurate beings in terms of how the law should recognize and protect their rights. Sorry, are you hearing a sound in there? I'm not sure where that's coming from. Okay, keep going. So that is to say, not just that how the law should recognize animals as kin, but also recognize colonized people as beings deserving of their own autonomous legal standing. And so for those of you who were at the last seminar, the last cover seminar with Matt York, you might remember that he actually spoke to us about a similar conjunction of animal and human in thinking about building that, his conceptualization of revolutionary love. So the reason I've opened with Leela Gandhi today is that I want to take that as a kind of emblem for my talk today. Her study is interested in how people and politics and knowledges came together to produce an anti-colonialism that was not, as is most commonly understood and theorized, driven entirely by the colonized, but one that has always and does always exist in relations of knowledge, power, and affect with the colonizer. And her emphasis there is on the question of imagining community otherwise, in that sense, right? So how can we theorize and practice community that is not simply a group of people who share an identity, or even people who are proximate in some way? And I think it's easy, at least inside postcolonial studies and colonial history, it's been common to think, it would be a common response to say, well, you know, if what Gandhi is describing there is anti-colonial, then they don't really belong to the colonizer class. They themselves are anti-colonial, are on the side of the colonized. But the point, as she emphasizes it, is that it's not one of identity in any sense of that word. The metropolitan Europeans she discusses in her study, and one example would be the missionary and dedicated Indian independence activist C.F. Andrews, were completely embedded in colonial logics and colonial practices and colonial knowledges. And yet, through the cultivation of affective community with the colonized and with other marginalized beings in the metropole, were able to build anti-colonial alliances. And what I'm particularly interested in Gandhi's study, for my purposes today, is the role that marginalized knowledge, such as theosophy, plays in this kind of anti-colonial community building. And I want to take that emblem of the affective community that is built around marginal knowledge and see what we can do with it to think about the parlous state of the humanities in the contemporary Anglophone world. So it's been commonplace to read and think of the humanities as under attack or in crisis for at least the last 25 years, actually probably longer. And the most normative explanation of that is that it's no longer profitable for universities to teach the arts and the humanities, and that's why they don't want to offer those courses anymore. I could spend a lot of time today explaining why that doesn't really, well, why I think that's patently untrue, actually, really, when it comes to it. Because not least of this is that, you know, humanities students require so very little from the university. They require so few resources and such cheap resources that the cost-benefit analysis always comes out in favor of teaching the humanities. It's a cheap and easy field to teach because people really only need texts, and the texts they need are sometimes old and have been in the same form for hundreds of years. So there's nothing you need to invest in there. But I'm less interested in those kind of normative explanations and sort of literature that comes from critiques of higher education and funding, especially because quite a lot of those critiques, I think, overlook, maybe that's the kindest way to put it, overlook the colonizing function of humanities scholarship, which I am going to talk about. And so I'm more interested in thinking about how the anti-colonial affective communities that are still needed can take shape if knowledges like literature are no longer authorized by their presence, their value, and their enclosure within the contemporary university. So I'm not making a claim, I'm not making a strong claim that postcolonial studies has been intentionally or even effectively building an anti-colonial affective community inside the university. As Jairo Funes Flores recently commented on social media, this is a quote, "Academia doesn't care about material decolonization. It just wants a topic, a subject matter that refers to the distant past rather than the colonial present," end of quote. And I think that's true. So I don't think that I'm not making a claim that postcolonial studies is some kind of special and rarefied form of affective community that needs to be protected. But at the same time, I do think postcolonial scholarship and decolonial scholarship, especially the work produced by scholars with direct or familial experience of colonialism, such as Edward Said or Stuart Hall, I would include in that grouping, has generated and elaborated a knowledge that is useful for anti-colonial practice and organization. And in part, it's done so by arguing for the value of thinkers and projects previously undervalued or excluded from the university or from the academy. So I'm thinking, for example, of the colonial criticism of the previous generation of thinkers who didn't have the same access to the academy, such as Fanon, C.L.R. James, Aimé Césaire. And you can see that there's been some kind of effect. This is seen most clearly now in the ways that texts that were previously considered unworthy of inclusion in the English curriculum by colonized or post-colonial writers or marginalized metropolitan writers are more and more commonly read on the undergraduate curriculum. They might not be mandatory, but they're read. Well, and actually, in some cases, there may be the odd text that even has become a mandatory classic, like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Nevertheless, perhaps because post-colonial studies, unlike gender studies, or in the American context, Black studies, has never been able to form its own disciplinary unit in the university. If English departments disappear, it disappears too. Postcolonial literary studies disappears. Postcolonial theory has traveled in the academy, at least into the social sciences, especially into anthropology, and more recently and fitfully into sociology. But that original disciplinary revolution in its literary form, in the form that we find in literary studies, hasn't traveled. And indeed, sometimes that literariness has been dismissed as background rather than essential to the postcolonial critique of knowledge. So this is why, for me, the question is, if English literature departments disappear, what will happen to this body of knowledge of postcolonial and decolonial English literature scholars and its community of knowers? And more broadly, what is at stake when a field of knowledge passes out of the epistemological regime that dominates our moment? So, roughly speaking, for me, what I think dominates our current moment is a kind of complex mixture of side discourses, capitalist economics, management, and bioscience, some kind of formation around those. And actually, is this what we think of characteristically as crisis? Is that actually part of the necessary decolonizing of English literature? Is this the end point of that trajectory? And is that the moment when we might amplify actually the decolonial force of postcolonial theory? So it's not that I always feel slightly kind of complicated to say this. In a way, I think what I'm moving more towards is, from one perspective, we can see this as a crisis in the humanities. From another perspective, I think maybe there's something else happening. Maybe there could be something else happening. Maybe there's something that we could work towards. But I'm a little bit suspicious of saying that because I think sort of temperamentally, I don't want to say that, oh, you know, every crisis is an opportunity. I don't mean that. But in this sense that, what does it mean to talk about this crisis and how does it intersect with decolonizing? I think something else might be good. So the context for posing this question comes from my long-standing research project, as I mentioned, which is a study of the past and present of literary governmentality. So governmentality in the form of the study of literature. And in my abstract for the talk, which I don't assume that anybody read, but I'm doing my own due diligence. In the abstract for the talk, I alluded to the origins of English studies as colonial management. And I just want to briefly explain that here to anchor our discussion. In the early 1830s, the East India Company that administered early colonial India was placed under greater legal obligation to educate Indians, to educate indigenous Indians. And at the same time, it was pledged to absolutely remain neutral and refrain from interfering with the religious culture and beliefs of Indians. So they had a moment where they were obliged to produce education that they wanted to do one thing and they couldn't actively show was doing another thing. And it's a self-conscious moment of experimenting with the process of colonial subject formation. It's a moment where the administrators of the East India Company are thinking, how can we make this kind of people? And then how can we subsequently manage them? And they were directly trying to answer the call from the British MP Thomas Macauley to create, quote, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and intellect, which is what Macaulay outlined in his infamous Minute on Indian education, which was originally published in February 1835. So there's a deliberate attempt, there's a self-conscious moment of thinking, how are we going to make these kinds of people and how are we going to manage them? And Macaulay was securely of the opinion that the ancient literatures and languages of India, so Sanskrit, Persian, Urdu, were useless forms of knowledge and that nobody needed them. And he was keen to impose the standards and practices of Western literature on Indians. But there's obviously more to this moment of literary governmentality than simply imposing standards. It's not just a question of saying, oh, this is what literature looks like, although that's going on too. It's the development of practices and organized forms for shaping the character of large groups of people at once. So large groups of people in a classroom to begin with, but then eventually large groups of people forming a nation. So reading and reflecting on literature originally was a late 18th century practice that aristocratic young men engaged in, individually, either by themselves or with a personal tutor. But because of the demand for colonial government, and actually later in the metropole government of the working classes, it was contingently adapted from that individual practice to a practice for managing whole classrooms full of students. So in rethinking literary governmentality, I think one of the challenges that remains is that it is a particularly effective way of managing the whole classroom of people. That's undoubtedly true. In order to interrupt that government and cultivate the students' capacities to refuse government, it's necessary to talk to them about literature quite differently. And I think that is something that postcolonial studies and studies informed by literary theory more generally can do very well. So what do I mean by that? For example, what I mean is rather than inviting them to work on themselves as people who know the world through literature, right? So they study the literature of the Middle East in order to understand the people of the Middle East. My practice has been to irritate them into thinking about how literature is a form of constructing and representing how they think of the world. So not assuming that it works that way around and literature is this kind of pure tool for them to know others, but that's how they construct them and other. And in postcolonial literary studies, that's an approach that comes really pretty much purely from Edward Said's work, dismantling the worldly innocence of literature study. That literature is some kind of pure realm of knowing that is away from the politics of the world. Another way that I mean this, cultivating this refusal, is rather than inviting students to relate to and identify with the characters they read, again, I provoke them into thinking about where their desire to examine and insist upon having access to the interiority of others comes from. This is something that Yoshiaki Furui, who has been deconstructing the affective turn in literary studies, calls the Western appetite for textual violence. That you have these characters in fiction, in novels that you want to know, and you want to know what they're really like and what they're thinking and what they're feeling, even when the text actually doesn't offer you any of that. That is the thing that literature students will do. They will offer you that kind of analysis of interiority, even when it's not in the text. It's a common complaint, in fact, and it's part of the discourse of the crisis in the humanities that students' love of reading is destroyed by philosophical and political approaches to reading literature. And I guess the argument I'm making here is that I think that's all to the good, where the love of reading is really simply the normative regime in which they are trained to use literature to fashion themselves into specific kinds of subjects. Tony Bennett has articulated this most clearly, what we think of as the normal form of reading. This is a quote from him, which is simply a matter of behaving correctly within a particular normative regime of reading. The literary or aesthetic effect turns out to be neither an unfathomable essence nor a scientifically explicable property of literary discourse, but the contingent product of modes of textual use associated with a particular moral technology, end of quote. So anything that interrupts the normalization and internalization of that literary regime, I would argue, works against its force as colonial government and probably, more into our contemporary moment as well, neoliberal government. So one of the animating questions of my research is, how does this literary governmentality, originally designed to produce colonial subjects, does it function in the contemporary moment? Or have the networks of people and texts and practices that comprise post-colonial studies been working to refuse that governmental effect of literary education. And is that one more reason why English literature finds itself gradually pushed into the realm of useless knowledge, or at least knowledge that that does not need to be authorized by the university anymore? And I didn't think today to kind of detail those, but I'm sure, especially those of you who are based in the UK, will have read of wholesale cuts of English departments in places like Leicester, in Portsmouth, cutting modern languages as well. I think it's kind of a related move, because modern languages departments are often places also where literature is studied. There's this kind of constant creep of just cutting these fields of knowing all the time. But again, I want to take a step back for a minute. I'm not claiming that postcolonial literary studies are the mainstay of English curriculums. It's not like everybody's teaching literature the way I just described, or even teaching postcolonial studies as central or as even as a mandatory course on the English degree. And I'm not making the claim either that that's the central reason why its epistemic value is dissolving. But it is part of it. On the other side of that, which is something I've been thinking about more recently, ever since the emergence of psychoanalysis and psychology as academic disciplines, literature has tried to attach itself, to secure its place in the normative regime of epistemology by attaching itself to those disciplines, to the side discourses in particular, more recently even to medicine and neuroscience. There's a lot of that kind of interdisciplinary work. And in these instances, reading, I think it's actually important that it's reading. It's reading, not writing or producing criticism. Is reattached to contemporary forms of government and subject formation that work through psychological norms and biopolitical power. So an example that I'm thinking of here would be a movement such as bibliotherapy. I don't know how many of you know about bibliotherapy. I've heard about bibliotherapy. Oh, look it up. It's widely associated with the work of a man called Joseph Goldstein. But essentially, it's a form of knowledge where reading fiction is reshaped as a form of therapy that is designed to help the individual cope with their life situation. So you go talk to a bibliotherapist and you describe what's happening in your life, and you get a prescription of books that you should read that would help you work out how you can adapt and adjust to your life. So there are ways in which literary governmentality can remain the center of dominant epistemology, and it does, like that. There are those kinds of movements. It's not necessarily in the same form that we recognize and practice it now, but it has ways of reattaching to the current regime and to its forms of government through, as I said, psychological norms and biopolitical power. But I'm curious to know, as I've said, as I said to you, I'm posing it to you as a long form of questions. I'm repeating the question. If we push literary studies out of the university, could we accelerate its decolonial trajectory? So not try to reattach in that way, but actually just let it go. And here it's opportune for me to say that in my research, I don't conceptualize reading literature as liberation. So just taking literary study out of the university is not to empty it of its governmental capacities, obviously. So if you consider, again, this is a UK-based reference, but if you consider how businesses like the School of Life have taken up bibliotherapy, for example, it's eminently possible that outside the university, literature just becomes a rampant form of contemporary governmentality. So reinforcing the side disciplines, and capitalist consumption of both books and book services. So as I understand, with the School of Life, you can, for a fee, you can consult a bibliotherapist and they can advise you to buy those specific books for your own self-development. And, you know, you can understand from that how that fits beautifully with everything that we want people to be doing now, that we want them to be working on themselves and buying books and buying services rather than education. So what forms then could literature, especially postcolonial study, take to refuse governmentality and build new kinds of affective community? I think the natural place to go is book clubs. That might make some of you wince for good reason. You know, not least of which is the idea that, oh, yeah, English departments are just glorified book clubs anyway. They're not. But book clubs as a form, because we recognize them as an instance of community, and they have historically had a role in bringing together people who had no other recourse to authorized circuits of knowledge production. So knowledge production in particular, because, for example, early women's clubs in North America, for example, didn't simply meet to read together or to drink wine, which I understand is important in book clubs. I've never been in a book club, so I don't know. But to give and attend lectures, as well as write reports, as well as fundraise and raise money to build libraries and create scholarships for women to attend university. Early book clubs were self-conscious spaces of education that clearly, in that case, historically, were about creating a space, a basis from which women could claim and occupy space in the university. So moving into the normative regime. But presumably one could rework that. Well, I mean, that's a question. Can one rework that? Another trajectory, another precedent for thinking of book clubs as that kind of space of serious education would be the Left Book Club in the early 20th century in the UK, a book club that was founded by Labour politicians and Victor Gollancz, the socialist publisher, or one of Orwell's earliest publishers, to create a space where members could, for a small fee, receive a free book every month and gather to discuss it and become informed about and actively engaged in anti-fascist politics. So again, the book club as a space for bringing people together across various kinds of, occupations, classes, interests. The problem, of course, is the transformation of even those kinds of marginalized forms. So the transformation of women's book clubs, especially as a result of their intersection with, again, side discourses and self-help discourses, has led to what R. Mark Hall has termed the Oprahfication of reading, so-called for the model made most famous by the American media mogul Oprah Winfrey and her Book of the Month Club. And the academic judgment of such clubs comes at least partly from the understanding that the books read in these clubs are not high literature, are not good literature. Although actually you can, the book club doesn't operate anymore, but if you look up Oprah's book club, you'll see that actually they're reasonably congruent, I would say, with what a reviewer on a well-respected daily newspaper would be writing about in their book pages. So novels of Jonathan Franzen, for example, or Marilyn Robinson, like serious novelists. So that judgment isn't quite accurate, really. But more accurately, I think the judgment is that what you have in that kind of book club is women coming together to identify with the narratives they read and use them as tools for self-reflection and self-transformation rather than rigorous literary analysis. And that's the judgment. And I'll just note in passing that what we seem to have come back around to is where we started, which is, you know, the 18th century aristocratic practice of reflecting on literature and using it to transform yourself. Is that essentially problematic when it's a group of, you know, middle class, upper class housewives in America doing it? I don't know. On the one hand, the oprification of reading literature points towards the problem I mentioned earlier, that simply taking reading out of the university doesn't change its relationship with the dominant episteme. So here, literature is still a form that is allowing you to work on yourself and improve yourself, either as therapy or personal development. At the same time, it points to the difficulty of building affective communities that are organized around refusing the modes of governmentality that already shape us. So self-improvement, self-development, patterns of specialist consumption, right? So reading books that are picked out for you as worthy of your time and energy. Those are all ways of reading that are already crossed by modes of making the self that reinscribe us within coloniality. So, to return to Gandhi's work as an emblem, it seems to me that we do have to take more seriously the idea of alliances with marginal knowledges that take us out of the realm of what we comfortably think of as knowledge. And so, you know, I was already mentioned that some of the historical examples she uses are now quite commonplace practices. So vegetarianism is not on the fringes anymore. Theosophy still is. But there's a description of late 19th century utopian projects by Orwell that gives a vivid flavor of the kind of bricolage, really, that might be necessary to build an affective community. This is Orwell's description. A magnetic field that drew every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure quack, pacifist and feminist in England. So you think of that as a description of the affective community, it ranges really from the silly, the absurd, the normal to the still very serious and important. Fruit juice drinking is very important. Clearly, one can't prospectively or strategically maneuver a knowledge that has already occupied a position in the normative epistemology into the margins, right? So I don't think we can strategize about saying, well, English literature should go over here and enter into these kinds of alliances with these people. But as I hope has become clear in thinking about the future of postcolonial English literature, I do wonder how we might respond to the crisis in the humanities, not by reattaching to whatever pockets of dominant epistemology that will have us, and instead cultivating friendships with the fruit juice drinkers and the nature cure quacks. And for some of us, interdisciplinarity has been an answer to the colonial constraints of disciplinary knowledge production. But I think it's worth underlining that what Gandhi is describing is not mere interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, but something altogether more politically childlike and daring, non-strategic and non-calculated. It is in this sense daring because one genuinely can't know in advance what will happen when one befriends the theosophists and the fruit juice drinkers. So as I come to the end of what I've prepared in my talk, I want to actually return to the beginning and to Stephen's introduction in a way, to step out of the structure of the problem as I've defined it, To say again that I've been working on this book for about 10 years, and during that time, I've always understood the problem in more or less academic terms, like as an academic problem. And so one that I'm interested in and committed to, but one that is also contained as a research problem by the scholars I read and the academic practices I engage with. So the book is an examination of governmentality and whether you can turn a practice like literary study around from its colonial origins to postcolonial and decolonial purposes. However, over time, the problem has become a more lived one for me as a scholar displaced from the humanities and into the business school, where as often as people reassure me of the inherent interdisciplinarity of management and organization studies, I feel uncertain and uneasy of what can come of friendship with the business school. And I recognize that many forms of critical scholarship come from management and organization scholars, and I absolutely don't mean any disrespect to anybody gathered here. But I'm also aware, like my peers who are working to reattach literature to, for example, side discourses on medicine or neuroscience, that I'm making an alliance with a dominant epistemic force in our society. And I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means, and I don't know where it leads. And I want to add that criticisms, of course, always, or criticality is always built into the normative epistemology, right? The fact that critical management studies exists and that critical work goes on in the business school doesn't mean that it isn't part of the normative epistemology, because, of course, criticality is one of the guarantors of any normative epistemology. And it doesn't signal epistemic defiance as such. And the reason I wanted to conclude with this, I guess, interlude, is that in presenting parts of my work before to my peers, some of whom are here, my peers have reassured me that, properly speaking, I don't need to make any proposals about the future of English studies, literary studies, in order to complete the study on governmentality. So it's enough as a scholarly project to describe and examine the terms in literary governmentality. But as the problem has become a lived one for me, it's also become more urgent for me to think about how literary studies can be hooked into networks of people and knowledges that will accelerate rather than smother its decolonial potential. And I think especially of my students over the last 20 years who provided me with that affective community inside the space of the university to think about literature and decolonizing together. And I wonder what will become not just of me, but of them. So that's why I want to bring that dimension of the problem out here today. That's the end of the long question, if you like, so that I can explicitly explore that question with you. But how might we actually, in the end, organize affective communities of knowledge that refuse colonial government? Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Cool. Thank you for that. That was super interesting, and I've got a lot to ask, but I'm going to be patient. And I saw Peter's digital hand up instantly, so I'm gonna just turn over to Peter.
Oh no, Mrinalini. First, I want to say, and I think I share with everyone, like, what a fantastic way to start our covered seminar for 2024. So thank you very much. And I think the questions you were asking are some of the most important. And I guess I had just a couple thoughts, and obviously, this is not my area of expertise. So I think this is why it's also fantastic that you're here, because I think you are raising these important questions. The first is, I think, in a broader sense, it's very important what you're saying, in that I have seen that some of what you're talking about has already been happening, but in ways that I think we would probably, at least here, not be very excited about, which is, I mean, the evangelical community has done pretty much exactly what you've said, right? In terms of starting book clubs, in terms
Mm.
of starting all these types of things that have brought in. I mean, one of the biggest areas, right, that they are working with is the New Age community, particularly in the US, right? So they've gone into every yoga class, they've gone into every class about enneagrams, right? And what they've done is create, as you said, this type of affective community, but with a very particular, goal and aspect to link it to a type of very right wing and very conspiracy theory oriented um, agenda, right? And I think this has also been very interesting in that you've seen this in parallel with the ways in which right wing reading groups, starting in the mid 1990s, coalesced into the exact ones that actually have been fueling the kinds of now very right wing populist movements against what you would call kind of traditional elite politics, etc. Right. So, I mean, I think what you're talking about is really important. And I think if I could be normative for a second, I think, it's not just a matter of trying to say, okay, well, this is a good idea. It's saying that, like, this is happening. And if we don't construct our own effective communities and really understand why they're effective and what are their political and epistemological implications, right? Then we're going to be as much in trouble as we are now. If I'm speaking from a kind of ethical, political kind of Connolly point about like this here. I think the other thing I would say is that, I mean, I always go back to one of my favorite opening lines from the book by John Carlos Rowe, which is that, when looking at American literature, he says, the American people have always been shaped by a really strong bent towards imperialism and a really strong detestation of colonialism. And it's interesting that you brought up the which is a funny line, but what essentially he's saying is that if you look, when he looked at the kind of American literary tradition, he saw that there was a very strong way in which even within the American literary tradition, people could critique colonialism as a form and really say we're not colonialist, but nevertheless not deal with the epistemologies of imperialism and universalization, right? And I've seen this very much when you're talking about the business school and talking about dominant forms of management knowledge, because what I've seen is that there has been a very strong trend to say, look, we don't want to impose our management style on anyone, or how we construct the subject of management, right? Like, I mean, every country, every group, everyone should have their own way of doing this, and we're really open to multicultural management. But the imperial epistemology that we need to be managed, and that we need to be managed for particular ends, right? That goes unquestioned, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of wondering in this sense, and I know that, I could give a more political economy account of this, but I'd be really interested because I think that's kind of been done from your perspective. Is in what ways can we not just engage in a type of, if you will, epistemological and normative critique through the kind of effective communities that you're talking about of colonialism as an explicit target, but actually the kinds of very strong imperial logics that I think go unquestioned, right? And I think that's very important for our research group because, one of the big aspects that we haven't done enough, but I know that we've been researching and things, is that, things like the commons, for instance, right? They started out very clearly in the modern sense as colonial projects, right? Of using cooperative and using these types of things for administrating colonial populations. Now, you could look at this as ways in which the types of movements that have happened since the 1980s around things like commons ownership has formed a kind of affective community to challenge this. But I would say one thing that hasn't changed is this kind of very strong imperial logic, right? That there is types of universalizing modalities, whether it's commons ownership, whether it's cooperative enterprises, right? that require a manageable subject, and we're just providing a different manageable subject.
Mhm.
And we're very open to different diversities around that. But the imperial universalization, I think that that has still been extremely hegemonic. So I just wanted to know how you kind of thought about that, because I think what you're asking is the exact right questions, and it's really important because they require more than just, I think, like a political economy account, right? They require the exact kind of account that you're trying to provide. So I don't know if that was helpful. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it was. Thank you. It sort of actually leads me to something that I didn't talk about at all. And I thought that I would talk about this when I was preparing the talk. And I've certainly been reading about it. But, in the context, for example, of Gandhi's work, what she's really talking about in the book, she talks about affective community. And she does mean that. But in the end, what it really boils down to is that she is really talking about friendship. Quite literally friendship between people who are, who don't share identities, who don't necessarily even share locations or anything, but sort of come together. And she's pursuing that whole, philosophical discussion of friendship that begins with Derrida and the idea of, friendship, enmity. How do you build a politics of solidarity? Can you build it from friendship, or is that too small? But I think actually, for me, this always returns to questions of teaching, because that's how I experience this work. And it's where, as I said, with my students, I've always found affective community with them, and so this is not an answer to your question. I don't think it's a satisfactory answer, but that's where I think it in the kind of philosophical response. So from Derrida onwards to Todd May, there's this kind of sense that, well, the only way in which we can resist and refuse the moment of government is really in those kinds of individual relations we take with people. So being a teacher who refuses to do the work of governing when you teach, or and also when you're a student, being a student who refuses the practices of governmentality on you while still acquiring the knowledge. So your question was very big, and my thinking about it has, in thinking about what Gandhi has to say, and as I said, other philosophers, thinking about the problem of friendship as it relates to the affective community and the building of politics of solidarity, that actually that's the only thing that we have control over, that we can do. And in the British university context, so for me, this is very live because I've just come from the Canadian system where I pretty much have complete autonomy of the classroom. I don't have to pass anything through a committee if I want to change anything on the curriculum of my course, or I don't have to, it's all about, and if a student, for example, comes to me and says, oh, I can't complete this coursework, I don't have to file a mitigating circumstances report. Like, it's all still extremely human. And in that humanness and in cultivating that friendship, as I have tried with my students, one former student is here and can tell you whether I succeeded in that. That actually the resisting of government is that small. And so in doing that thing and constantly practicing the refusal of government, you can build up a community of people who refuse together. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, Pete, but that's where that's what I've been thinking in the reading I've been doing.
Malte?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much. This was a really interesting talk, especially for someone like me who knows nothing about the topic. Really stimulating. I guess I just have a kind of a clarificatory question. So as you were talking, I thought there are different ways in which one could understand the question that you're asking. So if I understood you right, you're trying to answer the question of if English literature departments disappear, what will then happen to post-colonial studies? Sort of would it help advance the goals of post-colonial studies if these departments disappeared, or would it stifle their goals? Would it set back their interests? And so I thought one way of interpreting that question was that it's kind of an empirical question, sort of what are the real world implications of doing away with English literature studies? And I guess we could imagine some kind of methodology to answer that question. Maybe there are some countries where these departments are being dismantled to a greater extent than other countries, and we can sort of look at sort of keeping all else constant, sort of controlling for other factors. What are the implications of, dismantling a larger number of literature departments? But then, so my sense was that you're not trying to answer that empirical question, sort of what are the real world implications of closing down English literature departments. But then I was wondering if you're not interested in that empirical question, sort of what is the question that you're answering, that you're raising? I was wondering if you could clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say that's true, that I'm, in terms of actually tracking, so I alluded, for example, to the fact it's really England. It's really England where English departments are being shut down. It's a really weird thing to say, because in places like Canada or Australia or New Zealand, English departments are still intact as far as I know. And so, yeah, I'm not necessarily interested in tracking that empirical question, because really, I guess what I'm interested in is the governmental question. And the question of when you have knowledges that are or aren't authorized by the university, what happens to the governmental work that they've been designed to do? So literature has been in the Anglo context, and it is very specific to the Anglo context, because in other places literature isn't taught like this. In the Anglo context, literature has been designed to be a method and practice and an organization for producing a particular kind of manageable subject. And so I'm interested in what happens when that knowledge falls in or out of the normative epistemological field. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a potentially useful thing for accelerating decolonizing? So I guess it's kind of a combination, and for this reason probably a little bit opaque to those who've not been thinking about this problem. But I'm interested in the relationship between the epistemological problem and the governmental problem. So what happens when particular knowledges are designed to do something and produce particular subjects? And within that, to go back a step. I think the complication here is that what I'm in my book, what I'm really working on is, can you turn something around? If it's been designed to do this colonial thing, can you redesign it to do a decolonial thing? Is that actually possible? So that's the project there. But this talk is about the wider, I guess, question of, well, what happens when knowledges are moving in and out of the normative epistemological field? What happens to the governmentality that they can do? And I guess, for me, the counter-governmentality. So if literature is gone, does that just mean, well, we don't use that form of governmentality anymore? We don't need that. We have other things that we can do. Psychology, in particular, I think, much more effective. I don't know if psychology departments are getting bigger or not, for example. So it's really about that relationship between epistemology and governmentality that epistemologies carry with them and embody with them. Did that help? Did that answer your question? Okay.
To some, yeah. No, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Attica?
Hi, Mrinalini. This was a great presentation. I'm sorry. I hope we're not running out of time. Is there some time for a very quick question?
We have as long as we want to keep going.
Okay. Right. Okay. Well, I'd just like to, maybe share some of my comments relating to your presentation. Again, this is an area which I'm not very familiar with, but just from what I, read and what I'm aware of, it would really be interesting to see, how, whether it's just English literature we're focusing on, or whether, in other parts of the world, we're looking at, just literature, just the local literature in general, and in other countries, for instance. I could maybe perhaps give the example of something similar, which obviously is very, very politically driven, in India, where we see, populist leaders currently were trying to, so there were much bigger debates over there where they were trying to erase one of the local languages, which was Urdu, and especially the poetry by one of the indigenous scholars, Allama Iqbal, who was a very famous poet and author of his times, who led the Indian separatist movement in the formation of Pakistan. And I think, that agenda was very right-wing and very fascist and very politically driven, of course, to marginalize, the minorities, or in particular, the Muslim population in the subcontinent, particularly India. So I'm just wondering, since we're talking about English literature here in UK and how English literature is being, there's been, talks about its eradication from, many universities here, whether you would see that, whether you would like to trace any commonalities in particularly how it's very, very different, where I think over here in UK, there isn't really a political agenda behind its, or it could be, again, it's something to maybe compare and talk about whether, there is a political agenda. And since, it's really not targeted here at minority communities, which of course would perhaps have a different impact if any other language was being tried to, was being, rolled back from, the curriculum. So I just saw Passy's comment here is that, and those English departments in settler colonies still teach English literature. Yes, which is very, very strange because, while there is an attempt in other countries or other parts of the globe where languages which are related with, marginalized populations, there is an attempt to close those languages or wipe those out completely, which obviously have, some political agenda. But again, languages of the colonizers is still being taught. So it's kind of a bit of a, I would say, there's a bit of an irony here. And so I don't know whether there are any parallels you could draw between this example, which I gave, and UK. So it would just be interesting to maybe, look at this, how in other parts of the country, how indigenous languages are trying to be wiped out through poetry and through literature, because of course it has an impact on their minority populations in order to further marginalize and exclude them.
Yeah, thank you, Attica. It's a really interesting comment, and it also gives me an opportunity to say that obviously, so there have been places in the world where the immediate response. So I'm thinking of Kenya, and the response already at the University of Nairobi post-independence to say, right, we're not having English departments anymore, because that is absolutely not what we need in our country as we build it. But it was one of the only places. There's a famous article that came out of that called on the abolition of the English department. And so there was a very short moment post-independence in the English Empire, when places like India, Pakistan, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, all of them could have just said, right, that's enough. We're not teaching English literature anymore. And except for the University of Nairobi, nobody did. And so I think that there is something interesting to think about there. I mentioned, for example, that in the UK, it's actually weird that here in the metropolitan heart of things is where we are mostly getting rid of English departments now. And I don't actually have an analysis of that, of why that would be, because I think as Attika's example showed, actually what's more likely to happen is that still places that local literatures and local languages are shut down, not the global language. So it is actually quite strange that that's happened in the UK. I think the equivalent in the UK of this would be, and this has been quite widespread, the shutdown of modern languages departments. And modern languages departments, you can see, I think you can, this is actually a bit more speculative because I obviously don't study modern languages, but the decimation of modern languages departments very much follows the trajectory of Brexit. Right, so there's definitely political resonances there, where in the UK it does work on minorities, but it works on different kinds of minorities. There is a kind of political will to say we don't need to have any relations with our European cousins, so we don't even need to study German or French or Spanish or anything like that anymore. So I think that, yeah, there would be some work to do to think about why that is happening in England at the same time that the English are also shutting down English departments. And if anybody else has an analysis of that here, I'd be interested to hear that, because I don't have one yet.
I'm gonna call myself if you don't mind. So this is sort of a wandering question, but so in 1968, the National University of Singapore is established, right? This diffuse Singapore leaves the empire in 63, briefly joins Malaya, breaks up with Malaya in 65, right? So the first vice chancellor says, okay, we need to decolonize the university, which is, I guess, kind of a big thing, saying that in 68. But the way that it happens is saying, okay, we need to focus on national literature and the humanities. And we need to decolonize that. But all these things which are value-free, architecture, management, business, economics, and science, oh no, that's fine. And so there's an interesting thing here. And so what I'm curious about the way that happens is there a certain risk, and maybe this is not even the case anymore with certain programs closing, but when you create this kind of, let's call it like a division of labor, where like, okay, you humanities people decolonize, and we don't have to worry about the coloniality of architecture, management, business, infrastructure, science, all of these things. So what happens when we get this sort of division of labor of who is decolonizing and what's decolonizing? And it's also interesting because the way you talked about sort of the function of literary studies almost sounds like it was a tool for basically cultivating human capital. And in that sense, actually, it sounds like what we almost should be doing in terms of saying, okay, here's this practice by which you're being trained to be human capital. Is that what you actually want? What is that experience? How do we engage with the experience of being trained as human capital and make it defamiliarized, alien, almost a kind of Brechtian thing, trying to saying, here is the stage you're caught in. What if we point out, the curtains? Hopefully that's a question.
That's really interesting. I never thought about that actually as the decolonizing would be sort of like pushed into particular places in the university and then say like, you guys get on with that. while we get on with the business of actually, running the world, so to speak. I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
Well, it's also interesting because if you teach a module with management, accounting, and finance students, you'll get this. Sometimes people will admit to you, okay, the management students are really the hippies here because they care about culture and meaning. While we're over here, we deal with numbers. That's the real thing, not this fluffy meaning stuff.
Okay.
It probably wasn't helpful. Sorry.
No, I'm thinking. And while I'm thinking, by all means, anybody who has something who wants to contribute to that, please do. Yeah, I don't know. I've kind of gone down a little mental rabbit hole of my own now. So I'm having difficulty kind of articulating what I
I guess what I'm trying to think of there is almost like the difference of when you're talking about decolonizing literature, not in terms of content or who's included, but in terms of the relationality being shaped as a tool of basically cultivating human capital.
Yeah.
Because that's still there, even if who you're reading changes.
Yes, I think so. And I think that goes probably into the sort of mechanics of what have been thinking about, that as I said, can you really turn something that has been designed to do that colonial government into something that can do postcolonial government? Can you really do that, or refuse its government? Because I'm not sure if you can. And I think, as you said, if you can get people to read Chinua Achebe or Zadie Smith or whatever, but if you're still doing that thing in that same way, or using the same practices, the literary critic Heather Love has literary scholar Heather Love, who studies the history of English literature studies, has said, the way that we study this hasn't changed for 100 years. So we of course have not actually changed what it's doing, and it's impossible to do that, in fact. So that then, for example, moving certain kinds of literary studies and literary approaches and things into the business school would make eminent sense. But as you said, because it's the production of human capital, and it's really good for that. It's actually really a useful way to produce human capital. It's a really good method. It's really, I don't know. That's not answering your question either, but it is to say that I think part of what's still unclear to me is whether, I guess the most bold way for me to say this would be to say, can you decolonize this?
I'm not sure. There's also Peter has his hand up again, and there's a few comments in the chat which you might or might not have seen. I don't know, looking at it.
Let me just have a look at the chat.
Okay.
Oh, there's a course on Taylor Swift. Did not know that. Sorry. That is very interesting. I mean, I think I have to say, I will have to admit up front that I don't really have anything to say about the sort of the pop culture side of how English literature studies has gone. So, like, not the people who are sitting in rooms kind of reading the 19th century canon of literature, but people who are like, right, let's have a course on Taylor Swift or film, for example, or whatever, which is quite normal and commonplace in an English degree nowadays.
I'm sure you could suggest that Swifties and K-pop fans are very good at developing effective communities.
I'm sure they are. And actually, that's true. That is probably one of the reasons why those kinds of things have pushed into the university. Certainly, when I've been teaching literature, my students have often said to me that, well, this is what I really enjoy. This is what I really want to read. This is how I really came here. And it used to be Twilight, now it's Harry Potter. It's still sort of Harry Potter. Until recently has still been Harry Potter. But definitely that is that kind of affective community that builds around those things and pushes into the university to say, hey, pay attention to this. I want to think about this. And from the perspective of literary theory, you can say, well, everything's a text. So yeah, sure, we can study Taylor Swift if you like. But again, so actually sort of to go back to Stephen's comment, if we're still treating it as a text and doing those same things with it, we're just saying, yeah, sure, we can turn you into human capital through Taylor Swift if you like. We don't have to do it through Dickens. And yeah, but I've never taught Taylor Swift, so I don't know what the potential is with Taylor Swift. I don't even listen to Taylor Swift, so now I feel hopelessly like I can't answer that question.
Maybe Peter is going to offer an analysis of Taylor
An
Swift.
analysis, yes, maybe.
I
Peter?
guess not.
Are you there, Peter?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Yep.
Sorry. I think, putting the Taylor Swift point aside, which is its own interesting aspect, I think one of the things that, bringing together what you have kind of talked about here and what you've talked about here, Stephen, is that coming from, let's say, the US system, right, as a kind of working class scholarship student at a university, English literature and I would say continental philosophy played a very important role in a sense, providing a basis for saying, if you know this, even like little parts of it, you can be able to go into a whole range of different contexts, right, that you probably wouldn't before because it's a type of manners. Now, what I think is really interesting about this and why I think someone like Taylor Swift and things is important is that we've now kind of seen this reverse dynamic, right? And I would say this kind of massification of culture in which it's like, you shouldn't necessarily be able to speak about Husserl. That's not what's going to get you in the boardroom. What's going to really, really get you is to be able to speak in a very popular way about movies, about music, about current literature, in a way that makes you seem connected to this kind of affective mass community culture that we all share. And interesting, I don't know if this is helpful, but I saw this when I was a professor of economics in China in 2003, a very beginning, because I was teaching very basic, not basic, but I was teaching Keynesian economics and I was teaching monetarist theory and stuff. This was back when I was an even more boring economist, right, than I am now, which is, but one of the things is that they were saying was that, oh, and you know what would be great if you could start talking about American films for our students. And I was kind of saying, well, like, why would you want me to do that? I'm happy to do that, but I don't know how this has to do with anything about like investment strategies for supply and demand, right? Or let alone anything. And they said, because for our students, being able to talk about American movies is going to be very important when they have to go and make partnerships as economists or leaders with not just Americans, but with European partners. And this was particularly important in China at the time because they had this interesting rule that every single former state-owned enterprise had to be half owned by a Chinese firm and therefore half owned by a foreign firm, right? So there was this kind of interesting thing. And this also, though, included them, like, these kind of elites within the Chinese party, more learning about what everyday Chinese people are reading, because they also had to be able to get more in touch, right, with their Chinese investors, right? So, I would say that this has been very interesting, that when you look at something like Taylor Swift or whatever, it's not only a matter of relevance, but it's also a matter and really of exactly what you and Stephen have been talking about, is that while certain things like the English departments may be closed down or the philosophy department's been closed down, the functionality of how we use this and its content might have changed, hasn't changed, right? Which is disciplining us as part of, you know, a human resource, right? Like this is part of self as a resourceful subject, right? Yeah. And it used to be that like knowing, you know, Husserl would make me not seem like I'm a working class kid from Baltimore. But now it's being able to say that I listen to Taylor Swift, so I'm kind of with it with the kids. And I may seem like I'm talking lots of theory, but really I'm just like all of you. But it's true. And I would just say that where you've seen this interestingly is as there's a relationship between as economics has become more quantified, the types of disciplining to make this more amenable to people has become more massified and qualified, right? So it's like, I can give you all these models and I'm a financial engineer about these things, but I listen to Taylor Swift, so I'm not such a nerd, right? But, and this is a really, I think, a contemporary thing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but, you know, I think it really speaks to what you're trying to, what you've been pointing out, which is so important.
Yeah, I think that's a very instructive example, actually. I think because it is true that, I mean, yeah, as I sort of alluded to as well, it is true that we teach increasingly things that are of the moment and sort of contemporary literatures, but also contemporary film and new types of media, graphic novels, those video games, those kinds of things, and then we are getting into, I think really we would be getting into a question of, right, so actually does this do different kind of governmental work? Because these are different kinds of media and text objects. But again, sort of to go back to Heather Love's comment, you know, we teach it in the same way, we teach it for the same ends. The object actually, the change in the object actually doesn't do as much as one would think it would do.
Maybe as a counterexample, I'm reminded of a number of years ago, I was talking with Stanley Aronowitz, and he was talking about how before he became an academic, he was working in a steel factory back in the 60s. And he mentioned that, like, first they decided to have a book club, and the people in the book club ended up being what then became like the Wildcat Strike Organizing Committee. So there was this way in which reading together became not a form of becoming human capital, but became almost like I guess what Foucault would call counter conduct, right? Where I'm thinking of, I have a friend, Lauren Leave, who was first working with setting up reading programs in Nepal for young women, and discovered that there was an interesting, let's call it, beltway between learn to read and then join the Maoist rebels in the hills. So that would be another example of where the sort of the technique of, or the practice of reading rather than producing amenable neoliberal subjects produces something quite different. And so maybe it's a question of like how you hold the technique and what it does and what you're trying to do with it, rather than it necessarily making a certain outcome. Does that make sense?
Do you know what, I don't know, do you know what kind of techniques they would have been using to read together? Like, what would they have been doing?
I mean, I'm off the top of my head, I think that in the first example, apparently, okay, I don't know steel manufacturing inside and out, but my understanding is that at that point in time, there was periods of downtime when you'd be waiting for something to cool, something to prepare before you could go on to the next step in the process. So they were almost like reading novels together in the periods of downtime, rather than reading, like, say, critical theory text or whatever. And the Nepal example was people like learning basically like basic reading skills. So was it like, so I mean, yeah, I don't know much more than that about what the technique was, but you know,
yeah, I mean, I would like to believe, I do believe that there are other ways of doing this thing together that build other kinds of community. I guess I'm suspicious about a lot of the things that we have, because it's so difficult to do that kind of analysis then, because it feels like a sort of defeatism, that I'm always just kind of returning back to the point where I'm like, oh, but you know, governmentality, like it just gets you in the end. I don't really believe that, but at the same time, so I didn't talk about this at all, you know, there's no time and scope, but another part of the project that I've been doing as a whole is thinking about how it happens, for example, that particular kinds of scholars like Edward Said or Stuart Hall enter the university, do their studies in the most normatively successful way, and become postcolonial critics. So even inside the space of the university, it is possible to be using these things against themselves. But when you read their autobiographies, what you get is a sense that, not so much with Stuart Hall, but certainly with Said, you get a sense that he sort of did that himself, by himself, that it wasn't through building particular kinds of techniques and communities with others that he managed to do that. And so it sort of happened despite the university, but it did happen in the university. And that's always interested me too, because I think then, yeah, so then what is it? What are the mechanisms actually? What are the practices? What are the things? What are the relationships? What are the gestures we can make, but are all the time pushing against the governmentality? But even people who've experienced it find it kind of difficult to articulate that, oh, this is the moment that switched it.
Perhaps you're a bit hesitant to want to go that direction because it's too easy to back into a sort of reading together, and literature will lead us to liberation and freedom magically, because that's also a silly place to end up.
Yeah, I think so. Although when I've said that out loud, sometimes people do look at me and think, well, why not? Just let people read and they'll free themselves. And I just think they won't, though.
Cool. Do you have anything else you want to throw your way, or I guess we can call it a day and keep chatting or not? Actually, let's go.
Stephen, I was going to ask you, can you capture the meeting chat and share that with me?
Yes, I could do that.
Thank you, because I saw a lot of comments and things in there that I didn't have a chance to think about and get to, but I really appreciate the input, and I'd like to have a look at those things.
Cool. Okay, well, I'll send it to you after. Yeah, cool. Okay, well, we'll call that not the end, but the pausing point. And clap. Okay, thank you very much for coming along. That was super interesting.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the engagement and the questions and the comments. I really appreciate it.